The Investec 20 by 20 Media Awards is a new initiative which is built to recognise excellence in Irish journalism, which is based on the coverage of women in sport. And amongst the judges and author and journalist Anna Kessel, who joins us on the line. Good morning to you, Anna.
Morning, how are you?
Very good, thanks a lot for taking the call this morning. I suppose, just to kick things off, we probably at some point or another want to get to a place where an award like this is a straight out shootout between journalists, where it's not to do with women or to do with race, to do with gender, but we've work to do, obviously.
We do, and of course we have sports journalism awards already. We certainly have them in the UK, and there's a really good example of just this year. The shortlists have just come out. There was an amazing, really important global news story about women footballers in Afghanistan facing sexual abuse and violence, allegedly by the president of the Football Federation. And this story that made a global impact didn't even reach the shortlist of the awards.
Right.
It was batted aside by football transfer stories to the MLS or whatever. So at the moment, we don't value women's sports stories, and that's why this award is so important, because it's saying, yes, we do. Here's a big prize pot every single month. It matters. Let's improve the quality.
Yeah, I mean, maybe it's such a simple question, but a very straightforward answer. But we'll ask it anyway. Why does a story like that not get there, in your opinion?
I don't know. Even if you're the biggest dinosaur in the world, just on logic, surely that's a massive story, and that can't be kept out. Yeah,
you can see a shot of it there on the screen as well. Maybe this sort of question feeds into it, but maybe you've answered it already. But just sport generally as an industry, where does it sit, in your opinion, in terms of gender balance? Generally, when you compare it to other industries.
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that sport tends to think of itself as a different set of rules. But we've only got to look at the pay gap. For example, in football, it's women earn around 1% of what the men earn. So that's a 99% pay gap, which in any other industry would probably have people taking to the streets. But I think we're so used to this huge gulf between the way men and women's sport is treated that we just accept it.
Anna, what's your take on the connection between men's football clubs and women's teams that are associated with the clubs? Because there are huge positives to it, as we've seen with the likes of Manchester United getting involved with a women's team in the Super League. But also there's negatives to it as well. We had Stephanie Roach, the Irish international, in studio with us a while ago, and she was talking to us about her experience at Sunderland, where things were going pretty well for the women's team, but the men's team got relegated to League One, and therefore the women's team just suddenly went bust.
Yeah, we've seen that over and again in women's football. I mean, it happened years ago with Charlton. They got relegated, and the women's football team at that time cost around $250,000 to run, but it was just seen as dispensable. I like to think that where we've got to now, we are starting to move to a place where big teams are really valuing their women's team and seeing the positives that it brings. And if you just look at it in terms of a business sense, women's sport has so much room to grow because it's so small. The audience for it is such a smaller share than the men's audience. So just on a business level, that's where your revenue is going to come from. Grow that sport and find a new audience, and you will bring in the money.
So that even if we're not doing this for the reasons that maybe we should be doing it, that it has to be driven by a commercial thing, that's actually the thing that makes most sense, and probably in a lot of ways is probably the thing that results in the momentum that is certainly on this side of the channel is behind women's sport at the minute, that actually the commercial side of it is the thing that ends up getting this over the line in a way that, sort of mentioned at the top, that the 20 by 20 initiative has to be a thing, because we're obviously in a coming out of a very negative space in relation to the coverage of women in sport, but that the commercial driver behind all that is the thing that ultimately gets this done.
It just makes sense. I mean, there was one of the guys from Lewis FC, which is the only football club in the world to pay its male and female players equally. He was talking about this week, and he gave the really good example of Coke and Diet Coke. So Coke was, huge global brand. In the early 1980s, they thought, hey, let's set up Diet Coke. And, obviously, initially, it's a loss-making exercise. But now it's just as big a brand as Coke, and it brings in just as much money. But they spent time investing in it and finding a new audience for this new product.
Yeah. People frequently talk about the appetite that is there for, I suppose there's two sides to it, the coverage of women's sport and women's coverage of sport, if that makes some sense.
Yeah.
Some of the research that's been done, particularly around the 20 by 20 initiative, proves that there is an audience, if required. The research is now there to say that actually there is an audience for that coverage.
Yeah, there absolutely is an audience. I mean, when you look at some of the attendance figures for women's sport, they're really impressive. Millions and 100 million people watched the Women's World Cup cricket final. So, yeah, the audience is definitely there, but we need to keep growing it, and we need to make sure that, I think one of the problems with the media coverage is it tends to be few and far between. So it's very hard for an audience to follow a continuous narrative and really get on board with the sport and become fans in the way, for example, you have with the Premier League. I mean, you wake up and every minute of the day there's something new to find out about the Premier League. That narrative is there with you the whole time. But with women's football, for example, it's kind of difficult to keep on top of it. You can't watch all of the games. The Women's FA Cup that's going to be played this year, we'll see it on TV from the semi-finals, but not from any earlier round.
Yeah, and it feels as well, I mean, certainly over here we've had female sports heroes over the years. I mean, there's several of them come to mind, but Katie, obviously, Sonia Sullivan would have been there. More recently, the Irish hockey team, the Cork Gaelic footballers. There's a fairly long list, but in some ways, and it strikes me that maybe it's not so much to do with those heroes, that actually telling the everyday stories of the everyday athletes is kind of the space that we need to be in.
I think it's both, because I think if you only tell the human interest stories, then you have an issue whereby women's sport can never just be women's sport, and it can never just be an amazing goal or an amazing hit. Do you know what I mean? So, and it would be for men's sport. But I do agree that the human stories definitely are engaging in the same way that they are in men's sport. You know, who isn't compelled by some terrible, tragic backstory to somebody that then goes on to be a sporting hero? So I think it's both.
It was interesting, actually, in the context of what's happened this week. Alex Scott took to Twitter over the course of the weekend saying that haters are going to hate and I'm going to keep doing what I'm doing and things like that. And it does seem to me, and I know I'm only judging this on social media, which is a very small percentage of public opinion, but the opinion of the value of Alex Scott in a Sky Sports studio is starting to be realised by the greater public. I'm not sure if you'd go along with that, Anna.
Oh, God, yeah. It's brilliant, isn't it? I think, so many people, when they saw that Alex got that role, were kind of dubious. Like, oh, well, we know why she's there, right? It's a tick box. And it's a double tick box because it's a woman of colour. But she has absolutely proved that she is, an amazing pundit. And many people feel that her insight is better than, at times, her male colleagues, even really experienced people like Graham Souness. I mean, she was teaching him terminology about defence the other day. Yeah,
I kind of came late-ish to that story, the Alex Scott story, and I thought that there had been some sort of, as tends to happen in social media, sometimes a bit of a furore about something, and it turns out that people were just being, the way people are in relation to women involved in football coverage, and it was only now that I realised that it was just because it was a woman talking about football. Incredible. Anna, that was really good. Best of luck with the competition, and I'm sure we'll keep it crossed over the next while. We are involved with 20 by 20 ourselves, and there'll be much more on that over the coming months and years. But for this morning, thanks a million for joining us.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot. Anna Kessel on the line there in relation to the Investec 20 by 20 Media Awards, new initiative built to recognise excellence in Irish journalism and based on the coverage of women in sport. And Anna will chair that panel that's charged with handing out that award. So much more, as I said, on that. Off the ball, our media partners with the 20 by 20 movement.